Partially Examined Life After Show. I am your host, Danny Lobel, for the After Show. We're going to be talking about Hegel and logic today. We are joined by Mark of the Partially Examined Life. Big hand for Mark. Everybody.
Woo!
Hey.
Hello. Hey,
And
you're not going to call him Hegel, are you? You're not going to mispronounce the guy's name.
Hegel.
Okay.
Hegel.
Because there probably is another guy. There probably is another philosopher named Hegel that is.
I pronounce. If you ever listen to my show, Modern Day Philosophers, I'm notorious for mispronouncing every philosopher's name, no matter how many times I hear it or it's told to me. So that is one of my great specialties. I also mispronounced everybody's name, Mork. And we have a great little room here already assembled today. So let's waste no time and start meeting everybody in here. I'm sorry, Mark, were you going to say something?
Just before we sort of go do the whole rounds, I want to make sure that we, right up front, Chris Yeomans is our guest scholar to make sure that not all of us are stupid.
Hey, Chris. So, let's start with my mispronunciation. Would you like to comment on that?
Oh, no, the thing that I was thinking of is the British scholars who work on Kant, they can't say the ah. There's something about British English. They all say can't, right? Even these extraordinary erudite British Kant scholars, they can't pronounce his name properly. So
that is
more
my
just to
excuse.
say, I'm used to this sort of thing.
Thank you very much. That is my excuse. I am an erudite British scholar.
or perhaps just Australian, Hegel.
Yeah, Hegel. It's him. Dr. Littleman logic, huh? Thank God. Didn't agree with Kant very much, huh? I can't say his name right. All right, so Chris, thank you very much for being our resident scholar. It's an honor to have you with us today.
Thanks very much for having me.
Let's have you talk a little bit about your background in that case before we get to everybody else in the room. Introduce yourself properly.
Yeah, sure. So, I have been banging my head against this text for about 15 years now. You'd think I would have it more mastered than I do, but I really do think one of the brilliant things about it, like so many great philosophical texts, is you never feel comfortable with it. Every time through, whether I'm teaching it or in a reading group or in a discussion like this, I see some new angle or some view that was settled before all of a sudden just runs away from me, and I think, no, wait a minute, that couldn't possibly be correct. So I've been interested in Hegel's logic in a bunch of different ways. I am sort of particular.
Pronounced Hegel. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Partially for ways that it's relevant to questions about free will and agency. I've also done some work on how Hegel thinks about mathematics and quantity. This is sort of endless. It's an inexhaustible text. So like I said, feels like after as much time as I have spent with it, I should understand it better than I do. But every new reading, it seems like there's more that I don't understand.
What have been some recent things that have struck you in revisiting it that you hadn't seen before?
Yeah, well, I mean, this came up actually a good bit in the podcast that you guys did. In all of that preparatory material, there's all this talk of God. And by and large, that drops out when you get to the logic proper. But in that preparatory material to the Encyclopedia Logic in particular, it's really front and center. And I don't tend to teach that material when I do this in classes, so I'd kind of forgotten about that, to be honest. That's one thing. Recently, a mathematician friend of mine, so I teach at Purdue University in Indiana, and a mathematician there has gotten interested in Hegel, and we've been trying to pore over Hegel's philosophy of mathematics. And there's a lot more there than I thought at first. So those have sort of been two recent things that I've been struck by.
Thank you very much, and we look forward to. I'm sorry, Mark. I see you're about to say something.
Well, I want to move to Alan Cook next because he's actually the guy who scouted Chris for us.
Excellent, Alan.
He's one of our behind-the-scenes editors.
Okay,
Thank you,
well,
Al.
okay. The way I scouted out Chris was I just went to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on Hegel and just started Googling names of people who were currently working on these kinds of things and sent Mark a selection of names, and that's how Chris got to be here. On the pronunciation issue, when my undergraduate college, everybody had to write a senior thesis, and the best senior thesis got a prize, and for some reason or other at commencement, the invited commencement speaker wound up with the task of reading out the name of the prize-winning essay and handing out the prize, and so he had to read the title of the essay, which got rendered as Hegelian Casuality. So there are all kinds of precedents for mispronunciations here.
Right.
Well, I should mention too. Hegel, of course, was from the south, right? So he had this from the southern Germany. He had this heavy Swabian accent. So when he goes to Berlin, he gets really self-conscious about his accent. And so when he's lecturing, he clears his throat all the time. He repeats himself all the time. He's tremendously nervous and self-conscious. And that has been a boon to Hegel scholars like myself because students were able to take notes almost verbatim. So we have wonderful lecture or transcripts, essentially, of his lectures that if he was more self-confident, we never would have had. And that's basically down to his accent.
And that's why I mispronounced his name at the top of the show. I really wanted to bring his point to life.
Is somebody taking notes?
I wanted to get into the self-conscious Hegel and see if we could talk about accents. Who else is joining us? We have Carrie. How are you, Carrie?
I'm doing great.
Carrie?
Carrie, like Cary Grant.
Carrie. Okay.
Sorry.
Where are you joining us from?
I am from Vermilion, Ohio. Well, I'm here in Vermilion, Ohio right now. Hegel was sort of important to my thesis when I was getting my BFA.
Why?
I'm an artist. Well, the idea that I've been working with is that in art, it gives a place for the not quite so practical areas of philosophy to like have a place to kind of live. So I just kind of pull everything I can from everybody I can.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just really like Hegel. That's just why I'm here.
It seems that when talking about logic in terms of interacting with the world, that would be very appealing to any artist.
Yes.
It seems like an artsy kind of approach almost. We're also joined by Michael. How are you, Michael?
Hello, I'm fine, thank you. Good afternoon, or good evening in the UK, actually.
Have you joined us before? I think you
several times, but
yes.
both before you were host and after.
Yes, I thought I recognized you. And where in the UK are you?
I'm currently in Cumbria, which is just below the Scottish border, so very far north.
Very nice. Very nice. Good chippy places. I'm imagining right near the.
Well, one of the things that occurred to me talking about the pronunciation of Kant, which I think in Britain Kant is taken as somewhat pretentious, is that the Americans have a very strange pretensions about words because you hear them say things like nomenclature, which ought be nomenclature, niche, which grates on me immensely, which should be niche. And guillotine, which has never been pronounced guillotine in the history of the English language until it gone to America.
Well, there's actually a good reason. I have a good theory for this, Michael, if you're interested.
Go on.
I've thought about this a little bit before. If you think about it, language is the ultimate conquest, So, and I say conquest instead of conquest, just to sort of bring my point in a little more. When an empire such as the English Empire or the British Empire took over a place, even after they no longer controlled it, the place was left with the language, and the same with the French and the Spanish. So really, the ultimate conquest is language. if your empire is able to take over and change the language for a bunch of places, even once you leave, you've left your mark. So I think the founding fathers in America were like, look, we can't do away with English completely because it's just too much of a hassle. But there's got to be some way we could disrespect the English. Let's just start mispronouncing all the words wrong. So we can crazy forever. It's got to be it, right? And then forevermore they go, I just can't believe that they're not pronouncing it right. And everybody here is just laughing like, we gotcha. We couldn't ditch English completely. But we could bastardize it all right.
I think you've managed to turn unpretentiousness into pretentiousness. I think that's a success for America.
Well, thank you. Okay, great. And we're also joined by Preston. How are you, Preston?
I'm good. How are you?
Good to have you here.
Thanks.
And you are coming to us from a very dark room. So.
Yeah, I guess it's the windows behind me. They're shining all the light around me, but not on my face. I'm actually coming from Southern Oregon. Medford, to be exact.
Very nice. And is this the first time you've joined the Aftershow?
Yeah, it's my first Aftershow. I've been doing a couple of Google Hangouts on Gombin and reading a book by Ernesto Laclau, Slavoj Žižek, and Judith Butler with another friend on PEL right now.
Of course, if it's not an Aftershow, it doesn't count to us at all.
Okay.
So welcome. Welcome to the Aftershow. And is there anything you want to say about Hegel before we get into it?
I'm really just here to listen to what you guys have to say, and I listened to both the podcasts, and I've read a bunch of Hegel, his Logic, The Science of Logic. I've read his Phenomenology of Spirit, and a bunch of his works, and he's just kind of an enigma to me, so I'm really just here to listen, to learn, maybe ask a few questions.
All right. Well, that's a good place to start. Well, do you have a question that's burning you to begin with, to kick off the conversation?
Well, a little while ago,
what the hell was that about? Was that? Sorry, Preston. Go ahead.
No, sorry. I was talking in the middle of that, so I didn't even hear your witty response. So, no, I guess I don't really have anything particular. I guess you guys were talking a little while ago when I was watching the live stream on the channel about Hegel's conversation about God in the Encyclopedia of Logic, which I haven't read. So I'm interested in what Hegel's conception of God, because I am a Christian, but I'm more of I'm reading a lot of radical theology, death of God Christians lately, and so...
It is Easter Sunday, you know?
Yeah. Some of these death of God Christians, though, they look at Easter Sunday as like a do not resuscitate Easter Sunday. So God dies on Friday, but he doesn't come back on Sunday. So looking at the theology of that. But anyway, but thank you.
Okay, so I'll turn it over to Chris and to Mark if you have anything to say on that.
Well, yeah, I was curious about that too. I want to hear Chris's take on what are his theological views?
Yeah. So I used to think. Well, all right. So back up, right? So lots of people think of Hegel's talk about God as being like Spinoza's talk about God. It's not really theological talk. It's not that he endorses a belief in any kind of deity along the lines of what the traditional monotheistic or polytheistic religions, for that matter, were concerned with, but rather it's just a kind of mark to say, look, as much as you cared about God, you ought to care about nature and substance and the one and so on, right? So lots of people read Hegel that way. I don't myself think that's right, though. I think by the perspective of lots of contemporary Christian traditions, Hegel's going to end up being heterodox in a variety of ways. So I used to think that Hegel had what's sometimes called an inclusive Christology. Right, so I used to think basically Hans Kung, the German theologian, more or less had Hegel right. And inclusive Christology more or less says, sure, God was incarnate as Jesus in Nazareth, and in Joe from Hebron, and in Danny from Edinburgh, and everybody else, right? So I used to think that that's Hegel's view, but in the end, I think there's something a little bit more orthodox that's kind of in the neighborhood. I think he thinks there was something unique about the incarnation of Jesus. So he's a sort of traditional Christian in that way.
Where
But
do you get
the
that from?
uniqueness is, well, so there's some parts both in the philosophy of religion and in the philosophy of history where he seems to suggest that none of the rest of us could have this kind of divine, dignified significance that Kant thinks that we have if one person hadn't, as it were, led the way and been unique and extraordinary in this way. But I mean, look, I don't know, is this Orthodox Christian thought? I mean, it makes Christ, as it were, first among equals. And lots of people might tell you that's heretical, right? So I guess my view about God is that, to wrap up, I suppose, is Hegel's view about God is more orthodox than you might think. I mean, if you're interested in a good book to read on this in terms of the history of the time, Lawrence Dickey's book on Hegel, The Madison Historian, I really think is quite good. He's very good at tracing out what the different religious options at the time were and the different kinds of debates that were going around. But that's more or less where I've come to think about Hegel and God.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Would it be fair to say that the term God, as it appears in his phenomenology, by mentioning his entire philosophy, his metaphysics, it should be distinguished from what he personally believed the term meant? Because I'm thinking, like, it's a placeholder for reality. It strikes me as a kind of placeholder for real stuff. And if you just replace the word God with reality all over the place, you'd get sort of something sensible almost. But maybe not in his private life. In his private recollections, does he mean something more full-bodied than just what's real?
It's an interesting question.
Oh, yeah, I'm inclined to see it in the reverse. I'm inclined to think that his philosophical conception is more full-bodied than his sort of personal religious observance. There's not a lot of evidence that Hegel, for example, had a very was all that interested in the rituals of the church. Though you look at his philosophy of religion, and it's all about ritual. It's all about the cultic aspects of religion. He doesn't seem to care at all about the moral guidance of religion. It's very much a kind of mystical treatment of what kinds of communal ways we have of coming to union with God. Now, I mean, this suggests in some way a union with reality, as you're suggesting, right? Maybe this could be substituted, but then it sort of depends on what you mean by reality, right? If you mean union with the most real thing or the most real aspects of reality, then there's something right about that, right? If you just mean God means the collection of all that is, so some people read Spinoza this way, I don't think that can be true for Hegel. I mean, to use a bit of Kantian jargon here, God for Hegel is something like a distributive totality rather than a collective totality, right? God or the divine is some feature that's distributed throughout all of us rather than the collection of the whole universe, right, or the collection of all the positive properties in the universe or something like that. So given those caveats, I think you can make a kind of substitution like that, sure.
So maybe this gets us to something like the metaphysics, since that's usually considered a primary metaphysical question. I know that I pitched the second half of the episode as we're getting at at least the logic of the basic metaphysical terms. But I'm not sure if that actually amounts to a metaphysics. I mean, to say what is, it doesn't seem like he has a list of, here's my ontology, here are the types of things that exist, this, and this. It's more relativist than that. How are we supposed to interpret his metaphysics as a whole? Does he even have one?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so there's two questions here. So first is metaphysics as opposed to what, right? So in contemporary philosophy, we always contrast metaphysics with epistemology. But you can't really make that contrast in the logic, because there's an objective logic, there's a subjective logic. It turns out the most real thing is subjectivity. So the usual distinction that we draw between metaphysics and epistemology doesn't have much grip on the logic in that way. But on the other hand, I think your point is well taken, right? I mean, where is the list, as it were, from Hegel that rivals Aristotle's list of categories or Kant's list of 12? So Hegel has, no compunction about complaining about Kant's list of categories. Why 12? Why not 13? Where's the derivation here, right? And you might expect, oh, well, here's 13, or here's 14, or here's Hegel's list. But he seems to go in the opposite direction and say, in fact, right, list making is the wrong kind of activity to be engaged in when you're doing this kind of metaphysics. There's something less stable. There's something more involved in the world. There's something more dynamic than that kind of procedure. And so the problem with Aristotle or with Kant is not, as it were, they failed to do properly something that needs to be done. The lesson is, if the most brilliant people in the Western philosophical tradition couldn't do this, maybe that's not the thing we ought to be doing, and maybe their failures are successes in some ways. So, I mean, it's not an ontology in the sense that, say Aristotle's categories gives you this list of predicates that you could attach to any substance or something like that. But it is a metaphysics in the sense that it canvasses, as it were, the most basic categories that you could use to talk about anything at all. I mean, sometimes I think maybe the term first philosophy is a better way to come at the logic than metaphysics, because it's just so hard to hear metaphysics if you're a contemporary philosopher and not hear not epistemology when somebody says that, right? I mean, that's just so ingrained in us. But if Hegel's right in the phenomenology, which is a big if, but if he's right in the phenomenology, the distinction between metaphysics and epistemology, between being and knowing, is a really local and context-sensitive distinction. It's not the kind of distinction you found a whole philosophy on. I don't know if that helps Mark or responds.
What do other folks think? What did you get out of this?
Go on.
One at a time, people. Let's keep some order. Let's keep some order here. Yeah. Let's start with Alan.
Okay. Well, first, there certainly are other people who have done metaphysics this way, talking about these very general notions of being. I mean, Aristotle in the Metaphysics. I mean, he gets into these kinds of very basic questions about what is being itself. So, I mean, that seems to me to be a precedent here. As far as making lists of, categories of existence, I mean, the basic structure that Hegel gives us so much is not so much lists as it is these hierarchies of triads.
Mm-hmm.
Seems like, and if you get down to the bottom of all those triads, and since we only read the first little bit of the logic, we didn't get very much of what was given in the official reading for the podcast, but it's my impression that if you read through, all the way down to the bottom of all those trees, you do get into fairly specific categories like we would, of existence. Maybe I haven't read enough of it to really have a view that's worth listening to very much there, but that's my impression.
No, well, so I wouldn't want to deny that. And, I mean, this came out in the second podcast, the importance of specificity, right? So Hegel's emphasis on the understanding. right? In contrast to Schelling, to Romanticism, to views about intuition, right? What matters is being definite about things. So I don't want to give the misleading impression that it's all sort of one thing washing into another and you just sort of let it wash, as it were. But I suppose I would put it, instead of talking about triads, I would say what you get are certain paradigmatic kinds of transitions, right? You get certain paradigmatic transferences from one thought to another thought, right? Or from one content to another thought. I mean, so you guys spend a good amount of time talking about the movement between being and nothing and becoming. Yeah. And to my mind, if you look in the other parts of Hegel's thinking and so-called Hegel's system at what he's doing with the logical categories, almost always it's making use of these kinds of dynamic connections, right? That's what's really doing the work, right? So if what I meant to say it's not sort of a list-making activity, and by the way, I'm quite sympathetic to reading Aristotle as not really involved in that sort of list-making activity. In lots of places, the topics, for example, it doesn't strike me that Aristotle's all that concerned in numbering, right, how many of these kinds of predicates there are, and so on. What he wants to know is the different kinds of functions that these predicates could have. So I'm sympathetic to that view about Aristotle. But if you look at what Hegel's doing with these categories, right, what power or function they have in the philosophy of right, for example, it strikes me that it's primarily, well, if you're thinking about this, then you're going to be led to think about that and think about this other thing too. Right? But what he never does, as it were, is go down a list of things to check off, as it were, have we covered this area, have we covered this area, have we covered this area, right? It's not, as it were, that the categories of the logic are sort of optional tools that you could pick up here and there, but it is, I think, that certain kinds of transitions are important for certain kinds of phenomena or illuminate certain kinds of phenomena, and others don't. I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about those transitions for a second then. So
Sure.
the movement that as you say, we went on at some length about from being, how being collapses into nothingness, and when you analyze the collapse between those and the alternation, then you get becoming. How is that a metaphysical thing and not something psychological? Even if it's universally psychological, even if he's right, he's giving a correct phenomenological account that when you think of being and you think of nothingness and the fact that there's no quality that the two of these have that would distinguish them one from another, right?
Yep.
That was the argument given. So therefore, that one collapses into the other. How does that? I mean, I can see how you could make an argument based on the essences of the things, therefore that they're equivalent. But for you to say, no, it's the alternation back and forth between them in your mind that gives you the idea of becoming. Well, so that's something about my mind. How does that tell me anything about the world?
Yeah. So I'll give you two answers. Each as unsatisfactory as the other. The first answer is the first answer is, but the phenomenology of spirit, right? I take it that the phenomenology of spirit isn't a decisive argument for anything, but here's what it is. The phenomenology of spirit tries to trot out all of the different ways people have tried to make the distinction between subject and object fundamental. And it tries to show for all of these different patterns that Hegel can think of that it isn't. Right? Now, that's not a decisive argument, because there could certainly be some other form of distinguishing between subject and object that Hegel hasn't considered. There could be a new historical form of it, and so on. I take it the whole point of that book is just to say, look, if I've canvassed all of this, you've got to at least give me that it's reasonable, that we could start from a position prior to the distinction between subject and object. Right? So it's a long book just to sort of get one dialectical advantage. All right? So if that's true, then we're supposed to at least think that it's reasonable to think about being, nothing, and becoming as being, thought, whatever, right? As nothing more than what is said in the concept. I mean, here's what's, I mean, he says at some point, I think this is in the greater logic, that being and nothing and becoming are in a certain sense only logical categories in retrospect, right? It's only once you get to determinate being that you really have something that you can work with. And part of the point of being and nothing and becoming is just to show you don't really know what you're talking about when you say these things. So anyway, that was the first unsatisfying answer. Leads to the second unsatisfying answer, which is just
unsatisfying, by the way, if I may add. We're all feeling fantastically dissatisfied. Continue. We always aim to have the least satisfying scholars. You're doing an excellent job.
I'm glad I took the bill. And so the second is just supposed to be, look, all Hegel wants to get out of this, really, is becoming. All he wants to get out of is this notion that in the most basic categories and concepts, there's some kind of instability. There's some kind of dynamism. Right? Now, look, Hegel, in a certain sense, thinks this is a very Aristotelian point. Right? If, right, dynamic, power, energy, expression, force are to be the essence of reality, they'd better be the essence of thought as well in the categories that we have, right? But, so the second version of the unsatisfying answer is to say, if you can watch how this dynamism plays out, and Hegel can give you a construction of the difference between subjectivity and objectivity, that isn't a matter of the individual cognizer or individual perception or how appearances get strung together into experience, then that, which you only get obviously at the end of the logic, thus the unsatisfying nature of this answer, right, is supposed to validate beginning in that way. So the phenomenology is supposed to make it basically reasonable, and what you get out of that dynamism is supposed to make it plausible in the end. But again,
even less satisfying than the last one.
Well,
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Alan.
well, I was just going to say that, well, one part of what I got out of all that was sort of a very frequent move in philosophy is that in order to really understand this, you have to get to the end of the book. And
yeah,
it will all make sense. Yeah. You know?
Sure it will.
Nope, not going to happen.
Yeah. Chris started the conversation by saying he's been banging his head against the wall for 15 years about this.
Yes.
I don't think it helped that he wrote the book.
I mean, here's the funny thing, right? You look to the rest of the system, and being, nothing, and becoming hardly come up at all. Frankly, most of the stuff in the doctrine of being, that first third in the logic, hardly gets any play in the rest of Hegel's thinking. It's really kind of remarkable in some ways. Lots of stuff in the doctrine of essence, the middle third of the logic becomes important, lots of stuff at the end, but very little in the doctrine of being.
Okay, I want to return to Mark's challenge, which I thought he made very well in the podcast himself. He called it an un-Hegelian thought, and I'm glad that he's returning. I thought he put that very well in the podcast, and I wasn't really satisfied with the answers that the other guys gave to it. And okay, I'm kind of satisfied, Chris.
With the dog?
Yes, okay. Okay, well, let's say that leaving aside whether I'm understanding, let's say that I'll accept your explanation about how the way that being passes over into nothing is somehow metaphysical as opposed to psychological or subjective, because that distinction doesn't make sense or whatever. And let's get around to, in what sense is becoming the unity of those two things? Because, I mean, Aristotle talks about coming to be and passing away.
Yep.
And, I mean, he seems to be able to talk about coming to be without saying all these very mystifying things about negation and the negative and nothing operating when something is coming to be. And in that sense, I mean, Hegel just seems to be engaged in mystification. I mean, he's kind of a step backward. So maybe can you help me about what's the importance of negation, and how is negation involved in the concept of becoming?
Yeah. So, I mean, one way to read it, and I really do think being nothing, becoming is incredibly thin, right? It really does mean very little. That's why even in the greater logic, there's so few pages devoted to it, right? I mean, Hegel's primary point is we talk about being as if we understand it, and it's fundamental to our philosophical orientation. And in fact, you press on it just a little bit, and we don't really have much of an understanding of what it means. And so that failure and learning from that failure, one name for that is negation, right? So one way of talking about becoming is just as the very simplest form of negation. Again, in a certain sense, it's hard linguistically to say what it means for Hegel, because other than sort of the transition in the doctrine of essence, it doesn't come up very much. And when it comes up, Hegel says only sort of negative things about it. Becoming is precisely negation, as it were, with no control, right? Negation that is, in a certain sense, almost indeterminate. So, look, on the one hand, it's, I suppose, mystical, but on the other hand, it's a very thin, almost semantic point, right? I mean, so here's what you don't want to think, that Hegel is trying to say here that the whole being of the world dissolves into nothingness, and so the world is nothing but a roiling pot of becoming. Right? Hegel doesn't even think, to use the contemporary phrase, that we have the world in view when we're talking about being or nothing, but we've got nothing in view, basically, when we're talking about being. And so this is what I mean by suggesting that in a certain sense it's not mysticism, it's just a kind of very thin logical or semantic point. And that's why, right, I mean, when you get to arguments about substance, for example, right? So you might think, well, a discussion of being is going to go right into a discussion of substance. But that doesn't come until almost the end of the second third of the logic, the doctrine of essence. Those two concepts are going to be entirely distinguished, right? Now, that said, it is quite different from Aristotle. When Aristotle's talking about substance, for example, or being, he's very much operating in a kind of linguistic mode, right? So this is how we talk about it. Here are the phrases that we use. And that's, in a certain sense, it strikes us, you go back and read it, it almost looks like a philosophy of language, right? Now, I don't think that Hegel thinks his discussion is foreign from that, but it's abstracted away from any particular linguistic community's way of talking about things, right? But again, I think what he wants to get out of it is so minimal and so thin that it's not so much mystical. In a certain sense, it's the most formally logical part of the logic, I suppose I would say.
Well, and that is why we picked it. I mean, we spent so much time just talking about what is the dialectic, because that's what
Yep.
people hear about. What's Hegel? What is the logic? Why do you call it logic at
Yes.
all? Okay, because it's the dialectic, and so this was an example of it. I guess, is there a better example? I'm just trying to get at what is this thing? So the other example that we started to talk about, which is just really one step further, is once you get to becoming, you've gotten to determinate being, in other words, being a thing in particular. Well, being a thing in particular, that gives rise to the idea that there is something that is not the thing.
Yep.
You've got a thing in particular, and then you got determinate being, what he
Contrast.
calls Dasein, and
Yep.
otherness.
Yep.
And somehow,
Contrast. Yep.
with the contrast, you get out of those, you get quantity, right? You get, oh, there are two things, so now we
Yep.
and even you get different from the other is either back to the first or yet a different thing, perhaps.
Yep.
And so you get quantity out of that. Again, I don't. It seems unsatisfying as a way, either of those examples or the sum total of them, to then ground the dialectic as a fundamental way of thinking about things.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look.
Yeah.
So two things. You're supposed to be unsatisfied about it, I think, right? So this part of the logic, I think, is Kantian. You regress towards the grounds rather than starting with the adequate grounds, right? So you don't actually, right? So again, right, this is my third unsatisfying response. But
Nice try,
you
Ed.
don't get the grounds until you get the idea all the way at the end, right? It's in a certain sense, they're not bad examples to pick at all, if only because they're supposed to be unsatisfying in a distinctive sort of way, right? So lots of people want to talk about this in terms of Hegel's anti-foundationalism, right? Steve Holgate, for example, right? This is the way he wants to talk about anti-foundationalism. And part of what Hegel wants to make palpable to you is precisely how weak potential or attempted groundings of a philosophy would be in terms of some sort of direct or intuitive grasp of being, or some direct or intuitive or immediate grasp of determinate particulars, right? That would just give way almost immediately, right? So, I mean, I think, right, I mean, this is the pounding your head against it, but I think the reaction you're having is precisely the reaction that Hegel is trying to induce in the reader. The thing is, Hegel's trying to induce that reaction in the reader because he thinks it will motivate the reader to continue on with the text. But of course, right, as a psychological fact, most people have precisely the opposite response,
Right.
which is Hegel induces that feeling, and they think, what the hell is this? I'm not reading another 800 pages of the greater logic.
Even listening to the podcast, I got that feel. There were certain parts, and it reminded me when Mark was just talking, that it felt like Abbott and Costello routine to me, like the first thing or the second thing. No, that's not the thing. The other thing. Anyway, I want to go to Michael because he's been patiently waiting. Mike, how are you?
I don't know, enthusiastic.
You have the floor.
Give us the right answer, Michael. Give us the right answer.
Well, we obviously have a direct causal perception of the universe, and then all our concepts directly refer to it. Yeah, done.
We do? Is that obvious?
Well, I think so, but to transition back.
It seems that way.
Well, I mean, it is related to this discussion. It's interesting since it's a philosophy of language almost, because I think the becoming, the nothingness, the logical structure of that argument is repeated, it seems to me, throughout, in the sense of difference being some kind of metaphysics. I don't know what category you want to put it in, but it's elevated from a principle, not a principle of psychology or a principle of gaining knowledge through experience, but a principle of what the content of experience itself is, rather than what the experience communicates. And I'm quite happy for them to say, well, experience communicates an understanding of color through a difference, blah, blah, blah. It's quite another thing to say that the objects of experience are not there or not constituted or whatever without being different. Because I mean, it seems to me that this whole discussion, and it seems like this is true of most philosophy of the 20th century, is just lacking a proper theory of reference for words. Like if you say salt, then it means salt in the world, and that's why does it mean salt in the world? Because salt caused you to be aware of salt. Then there's no talk of difference whatsoever, because you don't need to distinguish between salt and the table, because salt itself caused you to be aware of the salt, not the difference of the salt in the table, if that makes sense. So I can have a direct positive reference to my words without having this sort of. I mean, it seems like when that breaks down, when I have to tell someone else what salt means, when I have to make someone else competent in the language, I then have to sort of regress into a kind of toolbox contrast. Well, look at that there. It isn't quite this. It isn't quite this. But prima facie, I think words do have a direct reference. But in any case, it just seems like that whole piece is missing from this discussion. So you're sort of left in a sea of, like a dictionary. You're trapped in a word refers to another word. Another word. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so this was my first unsatisfying response. I mean, Hegel just flat out denies that our perceptions are directly caused by the world. And he thinks he's got an argument against that in the phenomenology. That's the sense certainty stuff. That's the perception stuff, right? I mean, he's going to say look, you're helping yourself to this view about perceptual capacities that he doesn't think you're going to be able to defend. You're helping yourself to a notion of causation that he doesn't think you're going to be able to analyze and present, right? You're helping yourself to, in the case of causation, a whole bunch of metaphysical notions, Hegel thinks. You're way downstream from what he wants to talk about.
Isn't Hegelian's principle of difference baking in such a huge I mean, he's managed to contrive a metaphysics into a couple of principles, which, good for him, right? But from that point, his whole philosophy cascades, if you like. I mean, it's this triadic structure to the universe, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I don't see that somehow he's absorbed himself with metaphysics.
Well, I don't think that either. The question is, he thinks you have to somehow start to do metaphysics without helping yourself to any particular principles, right? So actually talking about principles with respect to Hegel is always very odd. I mean, you can't find a stretch of text where he's speaking in his own voice, where he says, I endorse the principle of identity or the principle of difference or something like this. I mean,
because he was self-conscious.
What's that?
I said that's because he was too self-conscious when he
yes.
Anyway, go on. Sorry.
So, I mean, look, I don't think the argument, if the argument is the following, premise one, being, whatever kind of premise that is. There is being, right? I don't know how you make that a premise, right? Premise two, apply the principle of difference, however that is, and the conclusion that you result from is nothing or becoming or whatever, right? That's got no hope of succeeding, I think, and Hegel sees that. I mean, this is why people are talk about it in terms of a non-foundationalism or an anti-foundationalism. The importance of difference, as it were, is supposed to he's trying to motivate this. Again, right? Your mileage may vary. Maybe you don't think when you think about being, it runs away from you and you find yourself thinking about nothing at all, right? It's in a certain sense, it's a thought experiment. But I don't think it can be that he's applying some principle there. He's certainly never, I mean, I don't think there's any text to appeal to show that he's doing that. And I think if he did, the argument is just a petitio and it's gone, right? I mean, there can't be any value to that. But again, right? Sorry, go ahead.
I just think, I don't want to run on, but I just think that the critiques I was getting, because I haven't read the logic, I've read the phenomenology of spirit, but I haven't read the logic. But the critiques I was hearing from the first podcast that Hegel was making of Kant and others were basically, look, they begin with a set of assumptions that pertain to how they characterize the starting point for philosophy. Here's why we can't do that, or here's why the assumptions all run into a mess, right?
Yeah, that's the phenomenology. Yep.
Yeah. Now, my view is that there's no way out of that. We ought just pick good assumptions and be done with it. But I don't see really that Hegel's talk, if you like, is doing anything other than that. He is just sort of crushing up assumptions and spreading them thinly over every page, rather than coagulating them for you to really inspect. And I think that's maybe that's even an element of self-consciousness in that, in the sense that he knows too much. If he spells it out too clearly, the game's up, and there's a principle afoot, and we have to
that devious Hegel.
He's robbing the reader of an ability to really critique his thing, because every page you turn around, you go, ah, well, I didn't mean quite that one, you know. And I'm not convinced that that's an entirely that it seems to be the contemporary retelling of Hegel, as it appears in Continental Philosophy, Zizek, and so on, is gives very much that impression.
Yeah, well, I got no sympathy for Zizek's reading, right? I mean, look, if you're willing to say, look, the best you can do is pick some assumptions that seem reasonable to you and find out what follows from that assumptions. And you just don't try and turn around and become critical of those assumptions. You just try and run out the consequences of those assumptions, right? Look, Hegel thinks that's the way all the special sciences work. That's the way most of human knowing works, right? So, I mean, you essentially just deny that philosophy in Hegel's sense can be done, right? Look, maybe you're right about that. But Hegel's after bigger game than that, right? Hegel's after a deeper kind of necessity than that. And maybe he doesn't get it. Maybe it's a kind of grand failure. But the kind of philosophy that you're proposing just seems like not even really worth doing as far as Hegel is concerned. But again, right, the argument of the phenomenology is supposed to be why that's just so unsatisfying and so radically out of order as a response to the need of the time, right? Hegel thinks, right, the cultural need of his time, or modernity in general, requires something different, right? But again, maybe it requires something different, and that thing doesn't work, and so it doesn't get what it needs, right? That lots of human life is that way.
Could I say one final thing?
Yeah, sure.
I don't want to too much. When I said you begin from a set of assumptions, I don't want to deprive a particular set of assumptions of being actually true. I just mean from our particular perspective that we start with assumption. For example, I start with the assumption that of a causal theory of reference, all words refer directly to objects. That's my starting assumption. But bang, suppose it's true, and then we have the right metaphysics out of it. So I wanted to just say I don't want to be uncritical of assumptions, and I think there are good assumptions and bad assumptions as a way of evaluating them. And I think that modern philosophy.
Let's play Sextus Empiricus. What about the person who just starts with the opposite and develops a philosophy out of that? Is there something to be said of that person other than yuck or?
No, but I mean I don't think the assumptions you start with are that you can be critical of them because they lead you down into having your knowledge or having your truth, or like there are certain things you need to try to explain really fundamentally, aren't you? You're trying to explain the fact that we're having a conversation, or that there's a laptop in front of me. What things are of your concern for your project, and if you start with those things that you're trying to explain, then there's going to be a good set of assumptions to explain that and a bad set of assumptions. And I'm not convinced that, for example, Hegel's method here really is giving me a satisfactory answer to the things I'm trying to explain. And if I say I'm trying to explain having a conversation with you, I don't think I'd appeal to difference or negation or any triadic system. I would just say that there's a world, you're part of it, I'm part of it.
But neither does Hegel, right? Hegel thinks the explanation of that has to do with the inner subjectivity that's built into human person. So for myself, I think believing that human subjectivity is built into human personality explains better what's going on in this conversation than a causal theory of reference. But that's where the debate would have to be joined.
Yes.
I think, I'll tell you what, Chris, I think Hegel was probably banging his own head against the wall for the 15 years.
Well, I mean, you guys read that second preface, right, where he says, look, I'm sorry, it's not written very well. It's the best I could do. I didn't have very much to work with,
All I had was being and nothing.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and a bunch of old forms and a bit of scholastic logic here and there.
There must have been one point where he was just throwing papers around going, nothingness! It's all nothingness!
So, Chris, maybe you can give us a little taste of the practical side of Hegel. I saw that the the thing that we posted on the blog,
Yeah.
that was a small chunk of your book, was all about his theory of action, and somehow this was in a book about the logic in particular, right? This is not just the philosophy of right or that part of the phenomenology about master and slave, and I know he has practical things to say about human nature, subjectivity, but how does the logic connect up with this stuff? Or do you want to say something about action first?
Sure. Well, let me answer the logic part. The main thing about the logic, yes, quite so. Right. Well, I mean, it sort of gets back to my earlier response. Hegel thinks something that is distinctive and unique about human cultural and political life is the way all of these different perspectives somehow hang together to illuminate a public world of sort of partially shared and partially contested meanings, right? So in his political and social philosophy, he's really interested, sort of as a sociologist, in trying to describe what the basic patterns of those perspectives are. So I take it, if you want to ask, right, in terms of the history of Western thought, who the first sociologists are, you've got more or less three options: Marx, Hegel, or Montesquieu. So Hegel's sociology is primary, part of it is in his discussion of the family, right? Regrettably, part of it is discussion of gender. Part of it in his discussion of the Stände, or the estates, right? These groups like the peasantry or the agricultural estate and the military and so on. But on my reading, all of Hegel's practical philosophy, such as it is an attempt to explain how these different groups of people leading very different kinds of lives can all be citizens of the same state, can all be co-citizens, as it were, can all have a meaningful political conversation. And the basic conceptual resources used to talk about that come out of the logic. They're really universality, particularity, and individuality, right? Each of those give you a kind of different take on the conceptual landscape. So to my mind, when you look at the philosophy of right, it's maybe too much to say Hegel's got the logic there as sort of a toolbox, right? Reaching in, I'll take this, I'll take that. But what he does have is a kind of geometry of conceptual space, if you like, that's set out by all of this stuff on the concept, by this almost unreadable stuff on the syllogism, right, combined in the stuff on the idea. And then he tries to sort of map these transitions, right? How can you say how somebody who spent an entire life on the farm could have a meaningful conversation with somebody who spent their entire life on a factory, right? Or their entire life in the clergy or something like that. The possibility of citizenship in modern nation states depends on that kind of conversation, Hegel thinks. And he thought his times were a time when nobody could really believe that. A time when everybody thought they were all going their own separate ways. And his conception of political or social unity, such as it is, right, is an attempt to explain how you could have these different sort of overlapping conversations, right? And so the logic plays a kind of background role in there. Again, there's the universality, particularity, individuality stuff plays a big role, and also the modalities: possibility, actuality, necessity.
Right on, man.
But I mean, look, you might think he just got it wrong. Right? I mean, Hegel. I mean, he spent a lot of time keeping up on German politics, on English politics, and trying to intervene. He wrote popular pieces on politics, and if you know how German history went in the middle of the 19th century, it did not go the way Hegel was hoping it would go, right? So maybe he just got it.
Credit for trying, you know. He put a good effort out there. He tried to get involved. That's something we could all learn from him. Is that you know, he lived in his time. You know, he was involved. He was a man of action, and whether you think he was right or not, it doesn't really matter. He just he got his voice out there, right? That's what you got to do. And it's kind of interesting, even in political times right now, when we're talking about this. You know, everybody's very polarized in terms of what they believe and what's going on in this country. And I think the thing we could take away from that is you could be right, you could be wrong. History will tell, hopefully. And in the meantime, just get out there and say it, you know?
Yeah. And, I mean, quite frankly, I mean, I'll say this about the profession of philosophy. We've not done anything like that as a group. We've made ourselves culturally completely irrelevant. And that's why I have great thanks to all of you for running these podcasts and these after shows and getting philosophy out there. I mean, this is just something, there's very few, right, to use a paradoxical term, professional philosophers who do any of this kind of stuff, right? Eric Schwitzgebel is a real exception that comes to mind. If you ever get a chance to get him on the podcast, do that. He's great. But by and large, in terms of saying something that's culturally important, contemporary professional philosophers have just been uninterested in it, which is a damn shame. And one thing you cannot accuse Hegel of.
Well, it's interesting because Marx did, you know, the philosophers only interpret the world, and the point is to change it. It's such a strange criticism if you know anything about philosophy to make that a claim about philosophers of his period, at least. I mean, there's something that Danny said there that history will prove them wrong. Is that really a view that Hegel would endorse? I mean, I'm always quite curious about this idea that one of the things I was thinking about, if I could just briefly
I did say hopefully.
Right. But it's a reification of history, which is what I was interested in. I was thinking that we're going back to the Jewish apocalyptic stuff that they were talking about, the biblical times hermeneutic stuff that the PL did. They were talking about sort of kind of revolutionary thought in Jewish apocalyptic, or at least I was reading something about that, maybe for the podcast or something else, I don't know. Anyway, it seems repeated in this kind of Hegelian thought. It's like this is like a secular, religious, revolutionary, like we don't have a lot of power now, but the social order of the world will be recast because of this revolutionary moment, that kind of thing. And I was just kind of wondering what Hegel's relationship to that kind of thought really is.
Yeah, I think he's quite distant from it. I think it has become almost impossible for us to read Hegel's philosophy of history not through a Marxist lens. I think, in fact, though I don't deny that there's a kind of Eurocentric progressivism to Hegel's thinking about history, that's not actually what he's most interested in. What he's most interested in is the way that these different historical epochs all present in a kind of magnified but therefore distorted form essential possibilities of what it means to be human. All right? So it's odd. You read, for example, his stuff in the philosophy of history about China, right? And at first you're reading along and you think you're supposed to be reading about the first societies in ancient China. But he's just as happy to talk about 18th century China and to say that those phenomena are a part of the same thing. And I think that's because what really interests him about China is that he takes it to be an entirely agricultural society. And so it's the possibilities of being human that agriculture highlights and makes visible writ large. right? He thinks, certainly falsely, that that's all that's going on in Chinese society, or almost all that's going on in Chinese society. So I think there's very little of the kind of apocalypticism or progressivism, right, in Hegel. I think his views about politics are quite mundane. And even if he, I think, in his heart of hearts does have that kind of enlightenment belief that in the long run things get better, that's certainly compatible with things getting worse for a millennia or so, right? So I don't see that he has a great deal of interest in those kinds of judgments. So he's interested in Greek philosophy, Greek drama, Greek sculpture, and so on, as articulations of the totality of Greek life. So I really think a sort of very unacknowledged influence on Hegel is Montesquieu. Right? He doesn't say very much about Montesquieu, but when he does talk about Montesquieu, it's always positive, and he always says the same thing. What Montesquieu gets right is if you want to talk about law, you want to talk about norms, you have to talk about the totality of a way a people lives. And you look at Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, and you see what totality actually means. It means climate, culture, religion, geography, commerce, right? State of culture, and so on. And so that's Hegel's interest. How do these things, as it were, synchronically, if you like that language, hold together, right? What do they show about the possibilities of the human spirit, right? Even though sometimes he thinks, look, those were possible in a way that makes them really not possible for us. This is his view about Greece. Right? He thinks their politics are not possible for us. We've just got too much property. We just can't care about each other, the state, as much anymore. Their art isn't possible because we've got a different monotheistic religion. We can't believe that that statue of Apollo actually makes Apollo present, and all of this sort of thing. But so I myself actually see Hegel as quite distant from those. Sorry, long answer to a simple question. Yep.
Well, it looks like you're. You got a good suggestion there for another episode. We should Montesquieu on the list.
He's a wonderful writer. Wonderful to read Montesquieu.
We'll have a Montesquieu mala branch cook off or something.
Yeah. I've got a view about who comes out best in that comparison.
Save it.
We'll have to have you back. Mark, I would think so. We would have to have you back on another after show.
I'd love to. Like I said, I really do think it's great that you guys are doing this.
I would say this is one of the coolest philosophy hangs on the web, and also one of the only that I'm aware of.
So who else has something from either discussion that stuck out at you, stuck in your craw, that you wanted to bring up? I know I have trouble even focusing on the first 2-hour discussion. It all seemed something to get through in order to get something that was a little bit concrete in the second half. But what did people come away with? Or
somehow I lost you.
Questions.
Hello?
Mark was hitting us with his musician talk, stuck in the craw. All this kind of cool slang that he's got from being his music life. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I have another question, if that's all right.
All right.
Because, I think I'm always very conscious because I know.
We'll go Michael and then Alan. Okay.
Right. Good. So, this takes us back to the very first thing that you said, and this is to do with what metaphysics ought to be contrasted with, and I mentioned sort of offhanding trying to include some of my own principles in the discussion we've had, and I want to come back to something, which is this distinction between experience and the content of experience, right?
Yes.
And or if we want to give you a better intuition for people who might not feel that intuitively, that there is this distinction between experience and content experience. You might say language and what words are about. So the sound, the noise is salt, and and salt. And there's the experience as a medium of communication or medium of presentation of stuff, and the stuff that it is presenting. Now, I myself would characterize the split between metaphysics and epistemology just along those lines as
Yep.
epistemology having concerned with the medium and metaphysics concerned with the content. However, so I wonder if you could say more about what it seems to me is the foundational mistake in early modern philosophy that comes from Descartes, which is an equivocation between these two things that they want to assert somehow that experience either can't have content, which is somehow unlike experience, or that you get the idea of this idealist assertion from Berkeley, I think. But I wondered if you could say more about how that plays out in Hegel, because I mean that's how the lens I'm trying to filter it through, if you like.
Yes. Yes.
Where did this divide? How does this divide up?
Yeah.
Well, Chris, while you're thinking about how to answer that, I do think it's worth interrupting to point out that, Michael, this is the very first time in the entire conversation that it struck me that you were not indeed lying on a rug the entire time. I'm sorry, but I had to get that in there. All right.
My grandmother's aesthetic criteria rather than mine.
All right, Chris, it's all yours.
Yeah, well, again, we're talking about the wrong text for this. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be having this conversation, right? But that's what the phenomenology is designed to address, right? So it's supposed to run through whatever 20 different ways of chopping up the content medium or referent language or experience object distinction, and it's supposed to show that they all fail on their own terms, right? So this is in the language that critical theory has adopted, this great project of immanent criticism, right? So here's what it can't be and what it looks like if you just come directly to the phenomenology, that he just rejects this notion, right? That there could be some difference between the two, right? Or that he just is uninterested in the end in constructing the difference between the two. But that's not the case. He's actually interested in all of the different ways that we try to do this, right? And he agrees, and this is what he says in the introduction to the Phenomenology of Spirit, that just denying that this is so is just as bald an assertion as saying that it is so. It doesn't get you anywhere. It's just another assumption that you could begin with. So if the logic has to begin from that kind of assumption, then I think it has to fail by the standards that Hegel himself sets in the introduction to the phenomenology, right? So again, a lot of the weight of the argument is borne by whether you think that you need intermediary concepts between, as it were, sensory causal input and experience on the other hand, right? Whether you need some kinds of concepts or categories to make that work. And if you do, then everything depends on what those categories actually look like. So the first two, whatever you want to call them, shapes of consciousness of the phenomenology are essentially designed to show you that you need those intervening concepts. That perception is not just a simple causal relation between the world and the mind, right? And then everything after that is, well, what do the concepts actually look like and whether they're good or not. But here's what I would want to say, because again, referring to another long and complicated and perhaps unsuccessful book is not the most useful thing to say, but only to say that I don't think, well, so two things. Number one, Hegel agrees with you that people like Descartes and Spinoza have made this mistake. He agrees about that. And that Kant and Hume showed that they made that mistake. And so you cannot simply go back the way so many, quite frankly, contemporary analytic metaphysicians want to do, as if you're Leibniz or Descartes, and just start by talking about the world and your metaphysical intuitions as if there's no distinction between mind and language. So I think, Michael, you and Hegel have common cause on this point.
Boom.
Right?
I wonder if he succeeds. That's my only concern.
Well, that's to call that a legitimate concern would seem to be an understatement. But let me say a little bit just about what the form of the solution is supposed to be. Hegel, remember I was talking about before about these interlocking perspectives and the way Hegel thinks about political and social life. He thinks it's more or less the same when we talk about perceptual life or even like sort of garden variety stuff. He wants to say what we continually mistake as a difference between, say, primary and secondary qualities, or between the object as it is in itself and as it appears to itself, are different aspects of the way that the object appears in different contexts. There's no in itself behind those. It's just that you can't ever see the whole thing at once. And so the trick is not to somehow find a way to go, say, from secondary to primary properties. The trick is to find a way to put all of the different aspects together. So if there's a single fable for Hegel about philosophy, it's the blind men and the elephant. You know this story, right? The blind men are led to the elephant, right? And the one I should know this. I say this all the time, but right, the one feels the leg and says, "Oh, it's a pillar," right? And the other feels the tail and says, "No, it's a rope," and so on, right?
And the unlucky one grabs the
right.
Yeah.
In human cultural life, some of us are unlucky, right? But so that's his response to this, to say there's nothing behind. There's no content that isn't simultaneously in appearance. But, I mean, I think he would take your challenge very seriously, Michael, right? And say the way that you try and show this is by saying that all of these different takes on the object have a logical structure to them. And there's a meaningful way that they can be connected. So here's another analogy that I use, and you can decide whether you find it helpful or not. So it comes from mathematics, from topology, right? So say you take a non-Euclidean space like a sphere, like the Earth, right? And you want to flatten it out into a Euclidean space like a map. Well, it turns out you can't get everything right. There's going to be some distortions. Right? You got to pick what distortions you want. So, look, the thing to do is to have a number of different maps that are distorted in different ways, and then you have a kind of higher order map, a transition map that tells you that point A on map X maps to point B on map Y. Right? So you don't have any undistorted presentation, just like you can't ever see the back of the sphere. But what you get are a bunch of distorted presentations, and then the skeleton key, as it were, to figuring out how those distorted presentations relate to each other. The logic is that transition map. The logic is supposed to tell you how you go from one distorted perspective to another.
It sounds awfully similar to the time that I got a triptych done at AAA to drive cross country. Distorted maps and several keys to be. That is a very.
So at least somebody found this helpful.
Yeah, no, but it's an interesting. I want to actually get into what you're saying a little more after the joke. So you're saying basically, if you have like a three-dimensional thing, and you wanted to translate it into a two-dimensional thing, then you're going to lose something in the transformation.
Yep.
So what you would need are several distorted ones.
That's right.
But why? Why do you need the distorted ones if you're going to wind up with the distorted one? Why don't you need just one that's not distorted so you compare and contrast it and know where your distortions lie?
Because the only, as it were, non-distorted one is a meta map. It's the transition map, and it's not really a picture of anything at all. And that's the logic, and that's why, right, in a way, the whole metaphysics, non-metaphysics debate is kind of beside the point for the logic. It's not a direct picture of reality. It's a way of connecting all the different ways that reality appears, right? So look, you want to call that an epistemology? I don't think Hegel cares all that much, really, as long as you don't think it's an epistemology of how one single cognizer could make sense of this, because it's precisely the map between how all of these different cognizers related in a society could connect to each other, right? Or can make sense of each other. So if you only have the transition map, you don't actually have a map of anything at all, right? So you're stuck with these maps. And on one map, Africa is the size that it ought to be. And on another map, it's artificially tiny, right? And so on and so forth, right? But the illusion, right? The if you want to speak in Wittgensteinian language, the picture in which we are in the grip all the time is thinking that there's this one undistorted picture, and the point of philosophy is just to find that. But Hegel thinks there's no undistorted picture.
If I may say so, just
yes, go for it.
Very brief. I mean, Hilary Putnam came up with a concept called metaphysical realism, and he attributed it to something called metaphysical realism, the idea that there was one undistorted picture, and he wanted to reject realism on the grounds that it required we ought to believe there is one undistorted picture. And subsequently, people said, well, no, realism does not require that at all. There can be a plurality of completely distorted pictures, each containing different things, and yet we can still have realism. So I think the only disagreement I have thus far, and I don't disagree with anything you said almost really, I don't think, is map of what, and I don't want to say of God advancing through negation. I want to say a map of the thing it's a map of. That's all I really want to say.
Yeah.
But I agree with all that. I agree with all that, you know.
Well, in a sense, I agree with you, right? I mean, this is you can't say at the outset what the logic is about. This is what's so damn frustrating about the thing, right? It's completely obscure what the actual subject matter is. And so, I mean, what you get in the end is a picture of actuality with a kind of deep conceptual significance. Hegel wants to call, in some moods, that deep conceptual significance animating actuality divine. All right? Now, maybe this is where you get off, right? But, I mean, it gets back to the question that we first began the show with. What does this God talk mean, right? Is it just, and I think in a certain sense the texts are radically indeterminate here, right? I don't think there's anything inconsistent with the texts in holding that it means what Spinoza means by it. I mean, I think Spinoza is an atheist, right, in any traditional sense. I think he just means you should care about nature, in his sense, and becoming one with nature in the same way that the mystics and the monastics cared about becoming one with God.
He's got to at least be agnostic, Spinoza. I mean, just how much even though his definition of God seems a little different, it's not that vastly different than Maimonides in so many places.
Yeah.
And I mean, the insistence on God, I mean, he has to be at least agnostic, I would think.
Yeah, right. I mean, look,
or he doesn't believe in a personal God.
Yeah. I mean, here's what I think one has to say historically. Our conception of what theism could mean has narrowed dramatically since Spinoza and Hegel's time. And there is, in a certain sense, a much wider variety of theological options available to them as real religious options than there are to contemporary believers. Right? And so, look, if you're willing to say, and maybe Maimonides wants to go this way, that the Jewish God isn't really a personal God, right? Because this is essentially what Spinoza has to deny. Spinoza has to deny that God could have purposes, right? Spinoza has to deny that God could get angry or have desires, right? I mean, all that stuff in the Old Testament, all that stuff has got.
Or it's manifest through nature.
Yeah,
like a hurricane or something.
Yeah, but even then, I mean, Spinoza just outright denies that God has purposes in this sense, right? Now, Hegel doesn't deny that something with intellectual intuition, to use the Kantian sense, or something absolute would have to lack purposes. He thinks it could. So Kant and Spinoza think the absolute couldn't have purposes. Hegel thinks that it could. Now, that's a step closer to personality in some sense. But it's still not, full-blown, there's somebody that I'm talking to in my prayer life.
Right, but what Maimonides was kind of saying was that any persona given to God is just a way that we're able to try and understand or relate to Him. But there is no way that you understand what God is, and there's no persona to God.
That's right. And so, I mean, look, if you take that to be theism, then there's a sense in which Spinoza can adopt something like that. Right?
That's what I was kind of referring to when I said there was. It's not that vastly different, and then there's also the concept of Maimonides gets into some ideas about what an angel is. It's an energy. I'm trying to remember what it was. An energy allotted to a certain thing or given to like a blade of grass. The energy that makes a blade of grass grow would be considered an angel. That's kind of Spinozian, right? That's like. Or Spinozian, if I'm going to mispronounce it.
Just say Spinozism.
As a kind of textual historical point here regarding this whole question of God, I think it was in the podcast that Amog said that that he quoted someone saying that. In order to really understand Hegel, you have to take the God talk very seriously. He made reference to a book by Frederick Weiser, which just entirely by chance it's the one book out of a dozen that I could have picked out that I just read in preparation for this. In fact, you see, I've got it right here.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Okay. All right. But anyway, and the thing that's most striking about Weiser's account is that he relies very heavily in his account of Hegel on some very early writings that only, unpublished things in manuscript. I mean, he refers as often to these unpublished early writings as he does to the logic or the phenomenology.
Yeah.
And he sees Hegel as not having made a radical shift, but as, and so I think that's an important part of that kind of reading.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's, and so Weiser represents the kind of reading that draws Hegel closest to Spinoza, but gives it an explicitly theological resonance, if you like, right? As opposed to that are people like Robert Pippin and Terry Pinkard who think the God talk is just metaphor for this kind of significance, right? I sort of find myself somewhere in the middle. I think he thinks, so here's what I think is there in the early works that I think does continue through all the works. That the Christian doctrine of the incarnation and the related doctrine of the Trinity are the deepest logical insights that the human race has yet come to, Hegel thinks. And so a lot of the logic is devoted to working out how you can put this in conceptual form rather than religious form, right? I mean, Peter Geach had a similar kind of attempt, right? He developed this whole notion of relative identity to try and do justice to the Orthodox Christian belief in the Trinity. But Hegel, I think, thinks that notion of the incarnation, that notion of something of absolute value being manifested in, embodied in something particular and local and relative is a deep conceptual point, And you have to, as it were, read the whole rest of the world in light of that. Now, look, in some sense,
reading the rest of the
sorry, what's that?
Is not the rest of the world.
The
Reading
whole
rest of
rest
the
of the
logic or
world
the
has to be
encyclopedia logic is
understood.
not enough. The whole rest of the world.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Yeah, and that's why you've been banging your head against the wall for 15 years. You
Yeah,
put the
yeah,
whole world
right.
into it.
So there's a form of significance or a level of significance that the incarnation makes manifest to us that we can then see everywhere in various ways to varying degrees, in varying levels of phenomena. So one last push for a book, Jim Krinis's recent book, Reason in the World, Hegel's Metaphysics and its Philosophical Appeal. If you're interested in Hegel's metaphysics, it's really, I think, quite good. But he argues that Hegel thinks there's essentially three orders of the world. There's law-governed reality, there's organic biological life, and there is so-called spiritual, which just means social cultural life. And the difference between those is that this intense kind of significance can be made palpable in spiritual, that is social, communal, political, historical life in a way that it can't in those other forms, right? And that means, Krinis thinks, and I think this is right about Hegel, Hegel thinks these kinds of phenomena are more completely explicable than those other kinds of phenomena. So go ahead, Alan.
What was the first of those three categories? I mean, it was organic and social, it's 2 and 3.
Yeah, the first is sort of law-governed, what physics deals with.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but, I mean, so I think, look, as I said, I think the texts are radically indeterminate about this. Does Hegel just mean by this that at a certain point in Palestine, there was this social phenomena where some one person for the first time grasped how meaningful human life could be, and that launched a whole tradition of meditation on how meaningful that is. But he put it in this weird narrative term that you would expect because he was a Jew, so he has to talk about the Messiah and so on, and really that can all be left aside, right? Or does he think there's something essential about that as well, right? And again, I think the texts are sort of radically indeterminate about that. My hunch, given Hegel's biography and the way, well, my hunch is that he endorses the religious stuff as having significance, in part because he thinks that religious stuff has a political significance. He thinks, right, he still thinks Lutheranism is fighting the good fight against both Calvinism and Catholicism. And he thinks the religious form of it is politically significant in this way. But, I mean, look, were he in some position where there was no political valence to that? Does he still think that? I don't know. Again, that part, I think, is indeterminate. But I don't think, as it were, that either the God talk can be entirely excised, the way, say, Pippin wants to, but nor do I think he's a kind of cross between an Orthodox Lutheran and a Spinozist, like Weiser thinks that he is. I mean, part of those early writings... Sorry, go ahead, Danny.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you, and Mark was going to jump in there, too.
There's Mark.
I just wanted to tell everybody... Okay, go ahead, Mark, sorry. You go.
Danny's trying to nudge us towards completion, and I wanted to help us along the way with that. I will say that Spinoza's Tractatus Logico Theologicus not the logical, the theological treatise is going to be the next big two-parter that we have. It's not immediate. It's not on the schedule. It's one of the next 3 or 4 episodes, but it's planned at least for summer. So that'll probably be the next after show that we have.
That'll be interesting.
If you're looking for somebody to come to the after show, I can suggest some people to you.
Great.
I will be happy to hear it. Yes, we always want to. Yeah, thanks so much for giving us the right answers. After all
they were unsatisfying.
Hey, exactly. Totally satisfying right answers.
Yes,
they pay me big money.
I feel like, if anything, you've undermined the picture. You know, he seems like he's saying over and over again the parts that we read, especially in the first half of the discussion, the first podcast, was just about how Kant was wrong, how we can know the absolute, how there really is a one undistorted picture of reality in that we can do real metaphysics, and but yet that has not been the historical upshot. That in fact Hegel and Nietzsche get washed together as sort of the twin ultimate parents of existentialism and postmodernism and all the rest of it, and you can sort of see where both come out, and maybe that the dogmatic side of him is the less convincing part, and maybe if you're right, the part that doesn't carry through the rest of his writing so much.
Yeah.
Interesting. Chris, please, if you're going to keep banging your head against the wall, put some padding on it, you know?
I'm losing hair, you know. I mean,
yeah. I want to thank everybody for partaking in the conversation, and thank you, Alan, for finding Chris. That was a good find there.
Thank you, Alan, for inviting me. Thank you all for the conversation.
Thank you, Chris.
And of course, thank you to Mark and everybody at the Partially Examined Live.
Thanks, Denis. Thanks, Denis. Denis
Remember, every time you mispronounce a word, it's a screw you to the English. But not you, Michael. Thank you, everybody. This has been phenomenal, and again, thank you, Mark, for continuing to facilitate these conversations and sparking everybody's whatever's going on in our brains, waking us up a little bit, and creating interesting dialogue. So, have a great week, everybody, and thank you for being here.
All right, thank you all.
Happy
Appreciate
Easter.
it.
Good evening.
Happy Easter.
That was a great Hegel talk.